So let me start by asking Dr. Rajgopal, sir. Sir, for the last 6 months, we have been continuously hearing the terms like source, testing, contact tracing, quarantine, etc., etc. It keeps reverberating in our ears even while we are asleep, sir. Can you give us an overall picture of who, what, where, and why, and how do you assess the current situation, sir?
Sure. Okay, thank you for inviting me to be a participant over here. I will start by qualifying myself as not being either a microbiologist or an epidemiologist, and I may not have the strongest answers related to this, but I will try and see if I can, in the course of the next few slides, demystify some of the jargon that is commonly used in relation to this COVID-19. First of all, remember COVID-19 because it was in 2019 that the first cases were discovered. Basically, it is what we call a coronavirus. The reason that it is called the coronavirus is based on its appearance. It has these protein spicules that project out, these spike proteins, which give it that kind of an appearance of the corona of the sun. But effectively, it is an RNA virus. That is, it's got a single strand of RNA, which it needs to infect a cell for it to be able to reproduce. And that is the way in which it initiates the infection that is causing all these problems that we are facing. Next. Can I have the next slide? Okay, where did it start? It started, as we all know, can I go back to the previous slide? Yeah, where it clearly started in a place called Wuhan, which prior to this virus was probably an area that none of us have ever heard of, but it really shot into prominence sometime in the middle of December. Even though China reported these first cases in December 31st, there was probably a long period of time before which they knew it existed, and there was a little bit of suppression of the information. And by the time it was reported and the WHO confirmed the existence of this new virus, it was spreading reasonably fast. And the first cases that came outside China was in middle of January. And by the middle of March, there were more cases that were outside China than within China itself. And 3 of the countries that really faced a very significant problem were Italy, Spain, and the United States, which were overwhelmed by the numbers of cases that they saw. Around mid-March, April, we started seeing the Indian cases rising. And probably we reached the 1 million mark as of a couple of days ago. The worldwide numbers have also reached about 10 million cases and identified cases at this point in time. I just want to make one point about Brazil. Brazil probably also is something that is extremely, having a very high rate of this infection. But there has been a problem in the sense that the Brazilian government has very strongly been against any kind of a process of minimizing of social distancing or of quarantining or of basically finding ways to prevent the spread of this infection. And it has been quite a disaster in that country. We hope that we won't follow that kind of a principle and probably will be able to limit the number of cases that we have. Can I have the next slide? As you see in this slide, this was somewhere, okay, I've gone from mid-April to probably what is current. And the 3 dark areas that you clearly see are India, Brazil, and the United States. And we have rapidly grown to the forefront in terms of the numbers of cases that we have. Next slide. I will show you the rate of growth with India reaching that 1 million mark on July 17th. There is a reported rate of 2.5% mortality. Some of this I will discuss a little later. I will not focus on either the recovery rate or the deaths because these are important for us to understand somewhat. Now, why did we get this virus? Is this something completely unique? No, a lot of these viruses, as we realize, are of animal origin, but do spread to the humans through what we call as intermediate hosts. The coronavirus particularly has been responsible for at least 3 different epidemics, pandemics. The first one was the so-called SARS pandemic, which was again from the bats, which went through civet cats in China and then subsequently spread to humans. There was one called the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, that was spread through an intermediate host like the camel and came on to the humans. And there is a suspicion that the current one spread through the anteater called the pangolin. and it is not very easily confirmable, but that is the way in which the intermediate host has been named. There is a lot of a bias in the way in which we look at all of this and say, oh, it is all these people who are eating all these funny animals and therefore it is spreading. I think that's a very unfortunate kind of attitude to have towards this. The spread to intermediate hosts and then the spread to humans is probably because of the closer contact that we have with these animals, probably again because of human invasion of their territories. So we should recognize that these are viruses that were existing in other animal species and then were adapted themselves to create infections in humans, and they have been clearly quite disastrous. Can I go on to the next slide? The process of testing this, considering that the coronavirus creates mainly a respiratory infection, which can be very mild. It can be like a common cold, or it can be like a classic flu where there is body aches and high fevers, probably with headaches. The worst kind of form that we'll see is patients who develop respiratory infections and get a very significant lack of oxygen in their blood. And that is usually one of the common reasons for the fatality. There is quite a variety of ways in which this can spread, but this is the commonest patterns of manifestation. Go back to the same thing, please. Go back, please. Don't move my slide. Yeah. And the way in which we need to test it, obviously, is to get the secretions from the respiratories from the airway, and it is done through what we call a nasopharyngeal swab. I hope none of you have been exposed to this yet, but it is quite a painful kind of a process where they stick up a gauze into your nose all the way to the back of your mouth, so that it touches the pharynx in the back, and then it gets a sample. They use what is called a reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction. It's a gene amplification technique, but the small amounts of RNA from this virus is sort of multiplied and amplified, and ultimately we are able to test this. Please remember, this test is not 100% certain. It is not because the test is poor, but the methodology that we use to get this sampling can result in a false negative value. That is, in other words, that a patient can have the infection and still be shown to have a negative test on the swab. And this is approximately about 30% of the situations. The ICMR is now recommending another kind of test, not because it is a better performer, but primarily because it is more easy to perform, because this PCR requires very special equipment which can be limited. The ICMR recommends a rapid antigen test, also obtained through a nasal swab. But one thing that we should do is we don't go around and ask for the blood tests, which are usually for antibody testing, because this can be useful from an epidemiology point of view, but their accuracy is very poor, and it is not a good indicator of the existence of a current infection. Next one. Next slide, please. Okay. So the question that is always asked is, what is this thing about contact tracing? So when a person gets infected by this virus, the virus initially does not cause any symptoms in this patient, and for a period of roughly about 5 days on an average, but probably closer to about 10 to 14 days on a maximum, the patient can have no signs of an infection. The signs of the infection will only start around that time. And subsequently, for about a period of 7 to 10 days, maybe going to a maximum of 20 days, the patient will have a clear-cut illness. And that is the period when we recognize them as clearly being infected. But we should remember that during this period when they didn't have the infection, the so-called incubation phase, the patients can have the virus and can cause it to spread to other people, primarily because nobody knows that this person is carrying the virus. So it is very clear that if this person has contact with a large number of people during that period, these people need to be identified, because they too can catch the infection and can cause a spread of the process. So the primary purpose is to trace these people who had contact with this infected patient, so that they can also be quarantined and they can be separated from the general population to minimize the rates of spread of this infection. Now, we have to remember, it is very difficult. If we go and ask somebody who has the infection, how many people did you meet? It is going to be very difficult for them to recall all the people that they have met. And to some extent, this kind of contact tracing in a physical kind of a way is going to be limited. And recently, there have been a large number of cell phone apps, of which the Arogya Setu that is being promoted by the government of India is probably very popular in India, which is basically an app which will tell you if the other person who you came in contact with also has the app. It tells you the number of patients, number of people who have had contact with a given case. And we have to remember the efficacy of these apps will only be very good if everybody uses this app. If nobody is using it, and the main reason many people don't use it is the concern about the safety of the privacy of the data that will be collected. And as a consequence, it probably is not a very effective ultimate application, but we should recognize that if everybody is willing to use it and everybody trusts this app, we can have a much better way of contact tracing and minimizing the spread of the infection from patient to patient. Next one. Next slide, please. Okay, which brings us to the other issue of what we call as quarantining. Okay, there is a big difference. Many people sort of confuse the idea of quarantining with isolation. Quarantining is a way of preventing somebody who has been exposed to the disease, but who don't have the disease at the present. So somebody has been exposed to a patient with the COVID infection, but currently doesn't have any clinical signs of an infection, should be kept in quarantine because subsequently they can develop an infection. And as we said, if it is in that phase when they are asymptomatic and then they're going to develop the infection, they can still spread the infection without their knowing it. And isolating this kind of a healthy person is what we would call as a quarantine. This is very typically being done, say, for instance, people who are coming from other states or coming from outside the country who have been exposed to a high risk and probably don't have the infection themselves, are being asked to stay away from others. This is distinctly different from isolation. Isolation is on patients who have been identified to have the infection, okay, and probably usually when they are mild, they can be kept in a separate home, separate place at home, but they can be isolated even in hospitals, and that is also another way of preventing the spread of the infection. Can I go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Okay. Then comes the idea of the lockdown, and this is what bothers a lot of us. Okay, the process of a lockdown is a more of a bigger strategy, not just of patients who have had contact or of patients who have, of individuals who have infections, but clearly of the general population itself. And here, the intention is to try and minimize the spread of this infection by minimizing the social contacts between individuals. This can be done by what we call stay-at-home orders or what we call shelter-in-place kind of orders, which will allow only people who are in essential organizations to move out of their homes. These are classically people who are involved in medical treatment, or for instance, even people who are working in these the stores that sell routine rations. They are what are considered essential services. Policemen, of course, essential services, and they are the only ones who are allowed to be moving around. And this sort of minimizes the kind of contact that individuals will have between each other, and hopefully will reduce the infection. There are many people who believe that this can be effective, but there are many people who have very strong suspicions that it may not be very easy to enforce. You can say isolate yourself, but if patients or individuals move between homes within their own flat, for instance, that kind of social isolation cannot be completely or easily enforceable. And so this brings us to the last question. Next slide. If it is something that can be marginally effective, isn't it a little too vigorous as a methodology? Is it like using a sword to kill a fly? And many people would feel that this may be very true, primarily because it is not just a way in which you can minimize this kind of a spread, but there is an adverse effect on the economy particularly, and the way in which it is hurting the extremely poor amongst us is something that is very, very sad to see. And there is, as we will discuss a little later, there's a lot of psychological concerns also that this kind of isolation will bring. And I think people are giving a lot of thought of not to use such a heavy-handed tool like a lockdown, minimizing it, but at the same time being responsible for avoiding the kind of spread by enforcing at least certain sets of basic guidelines in very focused kind of populations. So if we can isolate our elderly people, and if we all go through the process of wearing a mask when we are in social contact, I think we can continue to not have a lockdown and still minimize the impact of the spread of the disease, while at the same time preserving some kind of activity and economic activity through this process. This is a broad summary, in a 5-minute kind of a summary that I'm going to give right now. This is my last slide. Thank you. If you have any questions, or if there's any way in which I can interact, I can talk about it later. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that holistic picture.
Thank you.
Let me ask the next question to Dr. Tyagarajan, sir. Sir, the earlier generations in India have had the viral diseases like the smallpox, chickenpox, etc. But they did not have any drugs or vaccine for cure. They relied on traditional cure like neem, etc. How did they face the epidemic until the vaccines were developed, sir? Is there anything that we could learn from that and put into use today?
Om, it's a good point. What is the learning that we have had from those infections? If you look at the earlier diseases, like what you have said about smallpox or chickenpox, if you see, many of us would not have seen smallpox. I was actually involved in the WHO smallpox eradication program in the years of 1970s till 1982. And those periods, what we have to understand is the people have been following certain measures of prevention of the spread of this disease from one person to the other by adopting several conventional procedures. One of that has been the neem paste that is being applied, and there has been a lot of other faith along with which the prevention was done. We can also learn from another pandemic that we have heard. Next slide. This was on a Spanish influenza related disease in 1918, which is very much similar to what we are experiencing now, that is COVID-19. This Spanish influenza, when it was there, it was affecting millions of people, and then similar kind of wards have been opened as Spanish influenza wards, and even temporary hospitals have been constructed at that point of time to house them for isolation and so on. Next, please. And you will also see that same kind of mask system was also followed at that time, preventing people from spitting, coughing, sneezing, and also not to expose others to the air droplets that are the source of it. And they have also asked the stay home kind of a concept that was also followed at that time. So we people have been following that at that time as a preventive measure. Next slide, please. So then what is happening is the social awareness has also been practiced at that time, like, vehicles and buses and others, and even taking care of pediatric children by the nurses and others, parents, was also peculiarly practiced at that time. And people walking on the road, next please, will also see that they have been protecting like this. And a similar situation we can observe in the 1918 pandemic too. Next slide, please. So theaters were closed and so on. What I am trying to derive there is there has been enormous experience that have happened, and we are supposed to learn from those experiences, and we should see that humanity should never allow a repeat of the same mistake in 1918. However, it has happened. Now we have millions of cases of COVID-19 and almost similar kind of preventive measures we are also following, including the lockdowns and all that, and hope that the successful methodologies that are being adopted now with previous experience will be able to save the world out of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Let me ask the next question to Dr. Sudha Seshan, ma'am. Ma'am, we seem to have a range of weapons in our armory, right from turmeric, neem, soaps and sanitizers, which apparently kill 99.9% germs, masks, PPEs, etc. What would you rate as the best weapon sort of in our fight against COVID? Also, there are a variety of masks available in the market, ranging from surgical masks, N95, FFP1, etc. which mask works better, and does wearing a mask really protect us from coronavirus? And should everyone wear a mask at every time? Hello, ma'am, is it audible?
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, and let me start from the first question, the sub-question that you have put in. Mask or personal protective equipment, which is more efficient in preventing the infection? PPE is the most efficient weapon, but it is not necessary for everyone to be wearing the PPE. If someone is a frontliner, handling the patients every day, treating them, receiving them, it's fine that they need to wear the personal protective equipment. But for the rest of us, PPE is not essential. We are not frontliners. And mask would be the norm for most of us. There are a variety of masks available in the market, you say. Yes, there are lots of masks. And which mask would work better? Now, once again, I would like to say it is not necessary for any of us to be wearing, if you're not a frontliner, to be wearing any of the things like the N95 and so on, the surgical mask and so on. People who are in the field, they require the surgical mask, they require the N95 mask. But for the rest of us, if you are in the community, a reusable cloth mask should be sufficient. For community, please take it, a reusable cloth mask, or sometimes even the surgical mask is enough. N95 is not necessary for community use, but for hospital use or for a frontliner, N95 would be required. Now, what is the necessity for a mask? Who should wear the mask? Henceforth, for the next probably a year or so, or maybe a little less or little more, all of us need to wear the mask. The baseline here is, please think everyone is COVID positive. Mark my words, please think everyone is COVID positive, seropositive, which means each one of us could be transmitting the infection to the other person. So the policy would be, do not give, do not take. Do not give it to others, do not take it from others. And that is where the mask plays an important role. You have a picture there. Just see the infected asymptomatic girl. She does not have any symptoms. She is just speaking to someone standing in front of her, two people, and look at the risk of exposure of the one who does not wear the mask. In the picture below, you find the same asymptomatic infected individual with the mask on. The number of droplets are reduced, and the people in front are at a much lower level of exposure. So it is that the infected will have to wear the mask, and the so-called non-infected also, the susceptible person will also have to wear the mask not to receive the droplets. Now, one important thing that I would want to stress here is, I do find a lot of people wearing the mask, but then pulling the mask down when they have to speak. Please remember, when you speak, you're throwing as many droplets as you are throwing when you're sneezing. Now, I'm wearing the mask here. I'm removing it because this room has no one else. But then I wore it to emphasize that all of us need to wear it. And when we speak very often, we think that mask is a difficult thing, like, it's a sentence for speaking. We try to remove it like this and speak. And when I'm speaking, I'm throwing as many infected droplets as I would do when I sneeze. which means the person in front of me is at equal risk. So when you speak, please wear the mask and please insist on the opponent or the other person to wear the mask if he or she is speaking. Now, one other thing is when you're at home, many of us think when we are at home, we don't have to wear the mask. Yes, fine, you're at home and you've kept your home hygiene and the environment hygiene good, so you don't have to wear the mask. But then if someone else is coming in, your delivery boy comes in, he brings in food, or someone else is coming in, you have ordered for the LPG cylinder, the LPG cylinder boy comes in. When they come in, please wear your mask and receive them. You may be inside the protection of your house, but someone coming in could be a spreader or super spreader. So it is essential that you don your mask before you let them in. And when you're traveling, especially, two-wheelers, I do find people waiting at the signals, just pulling their mask down. And there's another two-wheeler which is adjacent, just within about 2 feet distance. It is a matter of risk. So please don your mask. It might be a little difficult. We have to get trained to it. We have to get used to it. It does cause a lot of difficulty. But then mask is essential for the next at least 6 to 12 months to come. Who wears a mask? Everyone should wear a mask. And that's the baseline of the answer. Everyone to wear the mask at all times when you think you would be susceptible. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Tyagarajan, sir. Dr. Tyagarajan, sir, we have heard a lot about this herd immunity, which even few countries like Sweden have relied upon, but the results are not so satisfying. So, sir, what are the challenges we face while trying to achieve herd immunity naturally to cope with this pandemic?
This is a very relevant question. I will answer it with the slides also. See, what we should do is, what is called as a herd immunity threshold. While we are talking about herd immunity threshold, we should also know that there are different types of immunity that can happen against a particular infection. If you take COVID-19, you are expecting a natural immunity that is coming in, which may be by means of a kind of an exposure to this particular virus, and then an active immunity can come in probably in a futuristic vaccine, and then the herd immunity, because of the community getting exposed to it, people get these particular kind of a protection. So this is determined by the R0 values of the infectious diseases, especially which are combated by the vaccines. There are several studies done on the R0 value of one particular positive person. How many of others this particular index case will be able to infect determines the R0 value. In smallpox, if you see, R0 value is 5 to 7 and the herd immunity threshold is 80 to 85. Mumps, it is 4 to 7 and herd immunity threshold is 75 to 86%. Measles is much more highly R0 value kind of a virus, which is able to bring about a herd immunity of 92 to 94. And we do have several kind of calculations for pertussis, polio, rubella and all that, which are able to give a significant disease, the kind of a herd immunity. But when you come to RNA viruses, especially the H1N1, which happened in 2009 as a pandemic, the R0 value was 1.6 and the herd immunity threshold was 40%. Regarding COVID-19, it is being now worked out of varying R0 value, which differs from country to country and geographic region to geographic region. Next, please. So when you come to the COVID-2, SARS-CoV-2, the natural herd immunity, it is considered by and large as a strategy to possibly prevent or combat the pandemic, given that there is no vaccine available till now? There are still a lot of unknown and unanswered questions, like whether the immunity that is acquired through natural infection would be sterilizing or persistent enough to build herd immunity, whether it is going to be neutralizing the new viruses that are entering in, or is it going to be continuing in the body for a longer time so that you will have a strong herd immunity that is there in the people. Epidemiological calculation and several modeling studies point towards massive numbers of mortalities and morbidities during the period to reach the herd immunity threshold. This is a risk actually. There are several epidemiological studies, mathematical modeling that has been done. Suppose if you have to wait for the natural herd immunity to occur in maximum percentage of the people, during that process, there could be a massive number of mortality that may happen, and the morbidities that we normally see along with can also happen. So that is a risk in waiting for herd immunity to happen. Further, there are several sero-epidemiological studies that have been, as you yourself have quoted, from Sweden, and even in India, an ICMR study was done much earlier, has seen lower seroprevalence rate of antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2, that is against the COVID-19 virus, indicating that it is still a long way to reach the kind of an expected herd immunity or the natural immunity being built in the population. So weighing the associated risk in epidemiological and immunological viewpoint, achieving natural herd immunity might not be a predictable solution or an early solution for combating COVID-19 disease. Hence, everybody is of the kind of a consensus opinion that a successful COVID-19 vaccines alone are the only way to control this particular pandemic. That is why all over the world, there is a global attempt to get successful vaccine. So is the case in India too. India has been one of the frontliners in manufacturing a successful vaccine against COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Hopefully, we'll achieve the herd immunity through vaccine soon. Next,
Yes.
let me ask Dr. Rajgopal, sir. Sir, how valid is the belief that only the elderly and those with comorbidities are only at the risk of dying due to COVID? It is noticed in Tamil Nadu that daily about 8 to 10 people are dying without any comorbidities, including even youngsters. So, is it reasonable to conclude that everyone, irrespective of other factors, are at the risk of dying, or could there be any variations according to demographic factors like age, race, or behavioral factors like smoking, etc.? If so, how to keep ourselves protected?
Okay. Can I get my slide? I'll show you from the slide. I just want to. So this is the statement that you're making. Go back to the previous one. You're saying that roughly about 10 out of 60 people who are dying in Tamil Nadu are younger people and people without any comorbidities. So is it very true that only the elderly are having a problem? Okay. And this, to answer this, we need to look at the first one, is there an association between the age and the mortality? And the second we need to look at is what is the proportion of all the people of these different age groups within the population. Now let's look at this very, very clearly. There is any amount of data, not just from this is data from the US, which was published in JAMA just 1 week ago. Okay, the data comes from China, from Italy, from everywhere. It is very clear the association between dying of COVID and your age is extremely strong. That probably till about an age of about 60 or 65, the chances of you dying of COVID infection is probably small. So if you get an infection, roughly, as we can see, anybody less than 50 years has got less than 1% chance of dying of the infection. Okay, and if you really look at it, the way in which you look at it, if you look at the broad group of patients, say between 80 and 65, the vast majority of them with an infection will probably not die. It's a very small number that will. But as you age beyond that point, there is definitely a progressive rise in the mortality. Now, if you're saying this, you should ask me the question is, why is it if I don't see so much mortality in the younger age groups that I'm still getting about 15% of the patients in Tamil Nadu who are younger and who don't have any comorbidity, and then they're still dying. For that, we need to look at the next slide. It is the proportion of these people. It is very important for us to understand that India is a young country, that people below the age of 30 are roughly half the population. And when you're looking at the people who are above the age of 60, that is only about 10% of the overall population. So if you really look at this kind of a population distribution, it is very clear even a 1% or a small percentage in a large group is going to reflect in a higher mortality than you would expect to see. So if you really look at the data, if you look at the mortality, it's relatively small between the 15 and 60, but they still constitute roughly about 25% of all deaths that occur, in contrast to the elderly, who may contribute to about 3/4 of all the deaths that occur. And this is quite important for us to understand. While age is correlated with the death rates, it is the demographic distribution of the younger age groups which makes even the less frequent mortality in that group reasonably prominent. This is very important. We should always look at the denominator. In a country like Italy, where basically the number of people in the younger age groups are far lower, and there was a dominance of people about the 80 or older, much higher rates of mortality that we could see. Okay, and this is very important for us to remember. The elderly and patients with comorbid illness are the ones who are likely to die. But it is important to recognize that the people who are going to contract the disease is uniform across all age groups. It is not like because you are young that you will not get a COVID infection. You will get a COVID infection, but it is extremely likely that it is not going to be very severe, or even if it is severe, your physiological strength is such that you will be able to fight this infection without dying of the infection. And that is what we should recognize. This is very important because there are a lot of young people who will say, okay, the chances of my dying is very small. That means my chances of getting an infection is very small. Not true, period. It is very important to recognize that irrespective of your age, your chances of getting the infection is very high. So even if you don't die as a consequence of this infection, you should remember that you could be a spreader and you could cause other people to get infected, and that is a very important issue that we need to tackle. So virtually, as was emphasized earlier, everyone needs to play their role in trying to prevent this infection from spreading, or even from the infection from acquiring this infection, and that is going to be very important. Is there any specific group that has a greater predilection for infection? There was at one time, there was a concern, since this virus goes in through what is called angiotensin receptor connection. There were people who are on medications, for blood pressure medications, who were using angiotensin receptor blockers, and there was a concern whether those people will have a higher rate of infection, but it's never been proven or demonstrated that that is true. The other group that people always talk about is the American Black population, where the rates of infection are significantly greater than what you would expect for the proportion in the population. But this is probably not related to the greater susceptibility to the infection, but primarily the conditions in which they live. They are poorer, they probably have more cramped dwelling spaces. Contact is much likely to be much greater. They are always in occupations that are considered essential. They may be policemen, they may be grocery store clerks who are exposed quite significantly. And as a consequence, the rates of infection under those circumstances are much higher. But nobody has demonstrated that any one human being is more susceptible or less susceptible to this infection than another. Okay, and we have to recognize that when you do get the infection, if you're young, you may be lucky enough not to die of it. But also remember that in a very large population, you're going to see some of the young people also dying of the infection. But you can always argue it's only a 1% chance or less than 1% chance, so I'm not really very worried. That's not very appropriate, because even if you do acquire the infection, the potential of spreading it to others is something that would be considered as your responsibility. So this is basically what I will like to answer. Let me just... Excuse me.
வெளியில ஓகே நான் அந்த மணில நிக்கிறேன்.
Okay. Can I go on? Basically, the question was,
Yes, sir.
are all types of people contracting the disease? Yes, all types of people are contracting the disease. Are there any variation due to demographic factors like age, race, or sex? No. Are there any constitutional blood groups or others that like blood group that is relevant for this? No. As far as we know, behavior, smokers develop lung disease, chronic lung disease, and they respond very poorly when they do have an infection. It is not that smoking predisposes you to the infection, but the consequences of the infection will be a little bit more difficult to bear if you are a smoker. So we don't know the effect of pollution as it stands right now, but there is always a concern that increasing pollution can be a factor that will influence any kind of lung disorder. So that is broadly my answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think there's no room for complaints whatsoever. Thank you, sir. Next, let me ask Dr. Tyagarajan, sir, on our very own Atmanirbhar treatment. Sir, on June 24, there was a report in which Tamil Nadu minister claimed 100% COVID-19 recovery via Siddha treatment, and they're also expanding the treatment for other patients in Chennai. Also, parallelly, Baba Ramdev's Patanjali launched its Corona kit consisting of 2 medicines that cure the deadly COVID-19 infection in 7 days. However, the Ministry of Ayush ordered the company to stop advertising. So how efficient are such medicines, and can really Siddha and Ayurveda be treated for COVID-19? Sir?
Just have my slides also. Yeah. So this is the current kind of approach that is happening in the country, whether there could be an answer from Indian systems of medicine. I will explain this from an international perspective also. Next slide. If you see the underlying principles of any kind of a treatment modality that you are thinking of, it is important to understand that there are certain international guidelines. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has recognized the validity of the traditional systems of medicine because of the rich literature background that is already there, and also thousands of cases having been provided with the treatment and finding out that it is helpful. It has specified certain very minimal kind of requirements so that any treatment can be projected as efficacious. Can I have the slide, please? So this particular thing requires, number one, we have to prove that it is a kind of a non-toxic, safe preparation. That has to be demonstrated in an internationally acceptable manner. That is one. That is what is being projected by WHO. The second thing that is expected is a kind of a limited efficacy study or the mechanism of action study. And thirdly, a limited clinical trial. Instead of going through the usual pattern of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, it stipulates that we may have to have a phase 3 clinical trial as a randomly controlled clinical trial, RCT. That is the usual design that is being followed. Next, please.
So I think there's no slide. Yes.
The slides are coming, if it is possible.
No, I don't think there's any slides.
Okay. So we have provided some slides. However, that's no problem. But what I am like to answer to this question is, in view of the fact that we did not have a successful treatment modalities, even in the modern medicine system, there has been standard of care that has been proposed world over with several combinations that were happening. And since Siddha treatment in, yes, this is the one.
No.
Actually, in Siddha treatment, there has been several preparations that have been projected, not only in Siddha, but also in Ayurveda. So the Ministry of Ayush has provided an advisory to all the states what kind of a preparation in any kind of ancient systems of medicine can be used, whether it is Ayurveda or Siddha or homeopathy or Unani. The overall they have given in adherence to the kind of advisory given by the government of India. The government of Tamil Nadu has also discussed about it very much scientifically. Madam Sudha Seshayan was also part of this particular subcommittee constituted by the government of Tamil Nadu. We were all there, and experts from Siddha medicine were also there. The director of Indian System of Medicine were there, and after all that, there was a advisory developed, guideline developed by the Tamil Nadu government, and they decided on what can be given. At the same time, it was also decided officially that these preparations can be given not as a treatment modality in severe cases, but it can be given as to mild cases or those who are infected or those who are having contact. So that they were wanting to see that whether we could give an immunological protection through this one, and that is where Kapasuba Kudineer came in for immense use across the population in Tamil Nadu by Government of India. And parallelly, Government of Tamil Nadu has also taken up leads to see that they could also be evaluated. In fact, the State Planning Commission, Tamil Nadu, as well as Government of Tamil Nadu, along with the Central Council for Research in Siddha and Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University, has been involved in this process of trying to look at them scientifically. And there are several collaborative studies that are also happening. And we are also doing a study to see whether Kapasuba Kudineer can be an immune booster by itself, and whether it is able to really trigger an immunological protection response, what we call is Th1 response versus Th2 response, as well as inducing an antibody booster against COVID-19 itself. So that is also a study that we are doing along with the Central Council for Research on Siddha. And Dr. Tamil Nadu, Dr. MGR Medical University has done extensive work on doing the in silico screening and other related kind of drug modeling related work they have also been doing. Coming to the question of Patanjali's Corona kit, the reason is that they were not being able to show certain standard scientific protocols and other related kind of documentation of having proved the efficacy and safety of that particular preparation. And that is why the government of India has advised them to withdraw it and to get it back after suitable kind of scientific kind of validations and study. So the Ministry of Ayush has taken it in a very big way actually, and they have constituted a national task force on Ayush, in which I am also a member, to really work out a kind of an integrated scientific approach to validate Indian systems of medicine against COVID-19. And there is a huge study, multicentric, that is being conducted in 6 different centers, taken several proven preparations, including ashwagandha and others, and that clinical trial is also going on. What I am trying to convey is that there are definitely very rich kind of indications in our Indian systems of medicine, backed by the literature background that is available, the clinical experiences that are there, and also the kind of observational indications of use of Siddha in patients, and seeing that they are able to come around with minor kind of symptomatologies and coming out of the disease per se. But what is required is it has to be really validated in a scientific design. Then it becomes comparable to any kind of studies that is done in any drug evaluation across the world. Then it becomes extremely publishable in an internationally acclaimed journals and so on. Realizing that requirement only, the government of India and government of Tamil Nadu are looking at it parallelly in several studies, and hopefully from Tamil Nadu itself, we may come out from the Tamil Nadu MGR Medical University, Ramachandra or CCRS and others, so that we may be able to prove to the world that the Siddha medicine is also equally giving an answer as a treatment modality for COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Hopefully, we will hope that the indigenous medicines will get proved. Next, now talking about the administration, ma'am, Dr. Sudha Seshan, ma'am. Ma'am, lockdowns have been predominantly used by many countries as a primary method to control the spread of COVID-19. If you could explain us what is the effect of such lockdowns actually, ma'am?
Right. This is just to have a recap before we go to the question on lockdown. You could see the first case in India was reported on the 30th of January. China is reporting to WHO, though China had cases before that. The reporting was on the 31st of December. And 30th of January was India's first case. And then 3rd of February, we just had 3 cases, all students from Wuhan, China, all in Kerala. And for about a month's time, there was nothing. On 4th March, 14 new cases, and all of them tourists, the Italian tourist group. And then on the 12th of March, we had the first confirmed death in India. That was a person with a travel history to Saudi Arabia. And by 15th of March, we had 100 confirmed cases, 28,000. 14th April, we had 10,000 cases. Can it move to the next one? Yes. And you see that how things have progressed. I'm not going by the dates, just look at it, how things have gone. The first death was on the 12th of March. Now, in between, there were certain super spreader incidents. March, there was a religious preacher with a travel history to Germany and Italy, and he became a super spreader. To start with, there were about 27 cases directly traced to him. Subsequently, through the contacts to 20 villages in Punjab, and nearly 40,000 people were on quarantine at a particular point of time, all because of one super spreader. And then March, there was another religious congregation, which most of us know. That was another new super spreader incident where a direct trace of 4,291 cases as on the 18th of April. Now, with all this background, India went for an early lockdown. On the 22nd, we had a 14-hour voluntary curfew. And then the first lockdown started on the 24th of March. And we have now come to the unlock phase. Now, what is the effect of all these lockdowns? Now, I'll skip some of these slides. I'll go to this. Now, look at this. You find a blue line there in the graph that indicates the susceptible population. And then, of course, we've shown the infectious population, the recovered population, and so on. This is a scenario. If there was no lockdown, what would have been the condition? For you to understand it better, I'll skip these slides and go to this, where there is a comparison between the scenario without lockdown and with lockdown. Had there been no lockdown, many people would have been exposed, and we would have had a peak sometime in early May or so, and probably it would have got extended to June and July. But then see the graph, you will find the peaking is much taller. Without lockdown, it would have been a very tall peak. With lockdown, it will be a short peak, number one. Number two, the lockdown had kind of made the peaking get pushed to the latter part of the year. Peaking would have happened sometime in May itself. But then we are now expecting the peaking to happen sometime in October, November. So what has happened is it has pushed the number of cases becoming more and more. It has pushed it by about 4 or 5 months. Now, what is the advantage? Suddenly, if the health sector is bombarded with lakhs of cases, the health sector, the hospitals, the healthcare management areas will not be able to take too many patients at the same time. The hospitals cannot manage. So one important consequence of a proposed lockdown in any epidemic is to make the health sector ready to receive that number of patients at a particular point of time. There are about 1,000 beds in a hospital. The 1,000 beds will be able to receive patient in full strength only if the health sector, the management of the hospital is ready for that. You cannot have a sudden rush of patients. So in any epidemic world over, the first dictum is that prepare the health sector to receive that number of patients. So go for a lockdown, try and reduce the number of cases, push the peaking to a little later part so that by then the health sector gets ready. The other objective in a lockdown is to cut the chain, break the chain of transmission. Now, as far as SARS-CoV-2 is concerned, let's remember it's a human-to-human transmission. Dr. Ram Rajgopalan gave a very beautiful slide talking about the zoonosis, like this could have come from pangolin and all that. Yes, nevertheless, once it has come into the humanity, into the human group, it is a human-to-human transmission. The best way to break the chain in a human-to-human transmission is to keep human beings away from one another. And that is why in a lockdown, physical distancing within the household, but then outside the household, if you are in the office for a long time, if you are in the college, if you are in the educational institution sitting next to one another, the contact is more. And that is the second objective in a lockdown. And there is another epidemiological point of view which we need to look at. In any epidemic, the first 50 days are important to reduce the number of contacts. The epidemic always works this way. The first 50 days, one person can spread the disease to how many more? Dr. S.P. Tyagarajan was talking about the R0. R0 or the reproductive number, if you need to remember it very simply, just remember one infected person transmits the infection to how many people. Now, when we started with the lockdown, just in the early phases, you will find, I'm just giving you the bare minimum details here. You will find the doubling time had increased because of the lockdown. In this graph, you can see the doubling time was 2 days. What is doubling time? The number of cases becoming more or the doubling time of the virus. Don't go into those details. Let's say if there were 2 cases, 2 becoming 4 was in 2 days. But then the doubling time here is increased to about 16 to 30 days across the country in different parts. Now coming to the R0, for Tamil Nadu, the estimated median R0 initially, sometime in April, was about 3, which means one infected individual can transmit the infection to 3 more people. Subsequently, in July, mid-July, the R0 had come down to somewhere between 1.09 to 1.7, which is a considerable reduction. And this reduction in the R0 was possible because of the lockdown that the country faced. Only for Chennai alone, if you take it also, the median R0 initially was 3 with a confidence interval. We work out a confidence interval because there could be fluctuations and adjustments need to be made. But then the same R0 has dropped to about 1.51 right now. You can see all these are results of a lockdown. So as I was telling you, in an epidemic, the first 50 days, it is the number of people who get infected. In other words, the number of people, the transmission to number of people that is important. But then after the 51st day in any epidemic, it is the duration which becomes important. Now, I'll tell you this way. Supposing there are 10 of us in a particular room, we just meet for about 15 minutes, nothing happens after the 51st day. But before the 51st day, 10 people in a room will matter a lot. After the 51st day, 10 people in a room for 15 minutes, the transmission will not be high. But then the same 10 people remain in the same room for about 8 hours, 9 hours, then the transmission is high. So after the 51st day, it is the duration of contact, but before it is the number of contacts. And that is the logic why a lockdown is always advocated in an epidemic to control the epidemic. And as far as our country is concerned, we find the lockdown has reduced the number of deaths, it has reduced the number of active infections, and it has pushed the peak a little later to the year, thereby reducing the height of the peak also, which is very important. The height of the peak will have to come down, and that is important, and that's been affected by the lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you for elucidating, ma'am. And also, ma'am, another question to you. Also, there are different mathematical models for predicting the spread of diseases. So, what basically is the difference between these models, and how the model results are actually to help of the government?
Yeah. See, these models, there are lots of models. You would have read, you would have seen in the newspapers, you would have read in journals. There are many people working with several models. In general, most people work with a mathematical model. But then a mathematical model is not very accurate. In a mathematical model, the R naught is arrived at from a previous publication, and then the R naught is applied. But in a true epidemiological model, the R naught will have to be calculated on the actual data available in the field. The difference is this. Supposing I have a published R naught for an RNA virus or a coronavirus. It could be some other coronavirus, or it could be some other RNA virus. There could be a published R naught information. The mathematical model normally takes the published information and starts working on that, which will not be very specific for the current epidemic. The epidemiological model works on the actual data available in the field. We take the number of deaths on a particular day in Chennai or in Tamil Nadu or in Maharashtra or in India, and then start working on that. So the epidemiological model is fairly better, gives better accuracy than the mathematical model. But then the mathematical models are also of some use. And why should we work on these models? The basic thing to remember about any model is that the model tries to capture the worst scenario for the epidemic. It is the worst scenario. If I project a model, I tell you, by October 15, we would have this number of cases. I would be trying to project the worst scenario. Why do I do that? I would tell you this is going to be the worst thing that can happen in October. Be ready, which means people in the front can prepare themselves, prepare the surrounding, prepare the infrastructure to reduce the damage. So generally we say the success of any model is its failure. If I say my model is successful, I should have given you the model beforehand so that you will be able to prepare the scene for the worst case and reduce the damage, reduce the number of deaths. So at the end of the day, you find my model is failure because I predicted 100 deaths and there were only 50 deaths. Then my model is a failure, but then that is the success of the model because the model is got implemented well as far as the workforce is concerned. The model always captures the worst scenario so that people in the front will prepare and get the best out of it. And that is the logic of any model. Several models are given by several people. In fact, generally the task forces which are specifically designed for this will take into account all the models, look into various factors, and you must also remember the model keeps changing. It will not be one single model. If I project a model, the reason why I'm skipping some slides today is that this is a model that we worked out as on 4th of July. From 4th of July to today, it's about 2 weeks, and the model would have changed in certain areas. The dynamic model will always take into account what is happening in the field at that particular point of time. And that is why in some of the models, you can see this is a model that the government of Tamil Nadu had given. And you will see there is something called a 3-day moving average. So for 3 days, generally it's calculated for 2 weeks. It is calculated for 7 days or 5 days or 3 days. 3-day will be the best because within 3 days, what has happened, you would be able to update. But then calculating a 3-day model every time will be difficult. So generally the models are calculated and worked on a 14-day basis. So within the 14 days, how many cases have been reported? Within 14 days, how many cases have died? And what would be in the recovery rate and things like that. Now, all these data are usually taken into account. Various models are taken into account by the task forces. And what is best suited for the situation of the state, of the district, of the town, or of the village is worked out and it is implemented. So models are required, but then it is necessary that all the information from the various models are kind of assimilated the right way and implementation done on the basis of the actual field data. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Another interesting feature about the COVID is without any universally approved vaccines or cure, the recovery rate in our country stands already at 63.3% with more than 6 lakh patients recovered from the highly contagious disease. So this shows the tremendous amount of effort that the doctors and the healthcare workers have put in. They are leading from the front in this global fight. Thank you, doctors. So, Dr. Rajgopal, sir, is there anything that we could do ourselves to protect, like diet, yoga, or traditional food, Ayurvedic medicine, or etc.? And do they play any significant role, sir?
Okay. First, I thank you for praising the doctors for this process. But I'm going to go a little bit into that and say, yes, it is important that the doctors do provide the care to have a reasonable recovery rate. But I think we need to be very careful when we look at this recovery rate itself as a concept. What are we defining as our recovery rate? If you say that 1 million people have got infected and only 25,000 have died, is the recovery rate going to be close to that? I mean, basically it's a 2.5% mortality. That means it's a 97% recovery rate. It depends on how you're going to define it. And that has been shifting a little bit over the period of time. In the past, when we were talking about recovery rate, we were not just looking at the mortality or the outcome alone, but we were looking at the number of people who didn't have a COVID smear positive at the end of their treatment period, which we find later is a fallacy. So we have changed it completely. And there has been a shifting in the definition of the recovery rate. So you have to just be very careful about looking at this recovery rate. And the longer you watch this recovery rate, the closer it will come to that 95% or so. So that is not a very relevant factor for us to look at. But on the other hand, if you're going to ask me a question about whether we can do anything to improve the recovery rates through processes like improving your diet or other factors, I think we can look at a few things. The questions that you've asked is diet, yoga, traditional food, Ayurvedic medicine, spiritual immunity important as a significant kind of a factor? I would feel very strongly that diet is an extremely important component, primarily from the fact that dietary excess and probably a lack of exercise is going to promote obesity. And we know very, very clearly that outcome in COVID disease is very strongly linked to obesity. The outcomes are very poor in patients who are extremely obese. And as a consequence, it seems very logical that some kind of a process of avoiding this kind of excesses is going to be very effective. As far as the rest of the questions that are concerned, it is very difficult. I don't believe there are enough hard enough data to say that yoga or traditional food or any specific aspect of your daily living is going to make a difference in terms of outcome. But I have a certain point that I would definitely like to emphasize. If ultimately death in the COVID disease is going to be because you develop a significant lung problem that requires you to be in the intensive care unit, where you're going to be supported with a lot of additional technology, there is one thing that strongly predicts outcomes in these ICUs, and that is your overall physical fitness. If there is an individual who is physically completely unfit, either because of underlying comorbidity, when they have heart disease, they may have limitations in their physical fitness, okay, or because they are just physically unfit, usually their outcomes are going to be very difficult. It is almost, I almost say that critical illness is like asking you to run a marathon. If I asked you to do it tomorrow, none of us will be successful at doing that because we are not trained ourselves. On the other hand, if we improve our physical fitness over a period of time, I feel very strongly that when you are faced with a crisis like this, you will probably be able to overcome that. So to me, more than anything else, dietary excess is something that can be easily avoidable, and probably a focus on physical fitness is also very important. Now, along these lines, people have always asked, in a lockdown situation, is it appropriate to go outside and run or to go out for a walk? Okay, and my argument is, as long as you're doing it independently and you stick to the basic rules of saying, wearing a mask, you don't go around and run with a group of people, you don't go around and have a conversation with a large number of people after your run. If you do something like that, you are obviously going to negate the benefits that you will get from the exercise. But I certainly believe in many places in the world, when they define a lockdown, they do allow exercise periods by individuals. Okay, but probably not in public parks. Right now, our beach is closed very clearly, and that makes a lot of sense because in beach people will agglomerate, and that is going to be a greater tendency for you to spread the infection. So individual exercise is probably something that I will strongly recommend. Careful dietary control, not necessarily anything specifically one kind of diet or another is something that I'm not going to recommend, but good dietary control, a focus on exercise and keeping your fitness is probably some way in which you can survive the bad consequences of the illness. I don't think there is anything that you can do to prevent the illness from coming onto you by any of these kinds of processes. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that. Next, an interesting thing, Professor Thiagarajan, sir, one thing that is spreading as fast as the COVID-19 infection is the conspiracy theory that the virus is human-made. Is there any semblance of credibility in such reports? Also, with the development in science and technology, especially in genetic engineering, why is it still hard to find a solution, sir? How long does the clinical trial actually take? Could you please share your views on vaccines and clinical trials?
Thank you. Actually, this conspiracy theory and the virus being projected as a human-made virus at the Wuhan P4 laboratory and all that is circulating in various places. But conclusive evidences have not yet come, even though circumstantial evidences show that from Wuhan only the virus has come out of that P4 high-level laboratory, high containment laboratory, and then it has moved around and all. We don't have a conclusive evidence now. But that apart, you must always acknowledge the international scientific groups working in combating COVID-19 through several healthcare innovations in the terms of diagnostics, in terms of treatment modalities and drug development, and also in terms of vaccines. You have enormous number of diagnostic kits that have come out in the market also world over and within our country. And India itself, Government of India has given a top priority to bring about diagnostic kits. Both ICMR as well as the Department of Biotechnology, BIRAC division have given a lot of diagnostic kits that have come in. Most of them are the polymerase chain reaction based kind of assay systems. And there are also some PCR point of care which can be done within a very short time. That is also being made available. And you have another technology called next generation sequencing that is also coming up, and isothermal amplification. I'm just only elaborating them to show you the variety of efforts that have taken place across the world, including our own country, that we have been able to successful in bringing about a kit. One important thing I would like to, can you go back? Tell you is our own Indian laboratory from Pune called MyLab has produced an excellent PCR kit that is now widely used across the country, even abroad, as a more sensitive and specific kind of a kit. So you do have these kind of variety of diagnostic kits that have come. So that is a success of recombinant DNA technology and CRISPR-Cas technology and LAMB assays and so on and so forth. Next will be regarding the kind of treatment that are there. You have several kind of modalities that have been there, 6 different kind of preparation to treat the symptoms, and then 12 different preparations for anti-inflammation and antivirals also have come in. Majority of them are in the preclinical stages, but many of them have gone into the various phases of clinical trials. Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, as per the international kind of regulations and other clinical trial regulations. Just to give a recap on what kind of clinical, we keep on saying about clinical trials. Why do we do clinical trials and how it is important in drug development is also better to understand it in the sense that you have to have a drug candidate developed initially with various kind of options. The in silico screening of compounds is a starting point of indicating a possible kind of drug candidates, and then going ahead to doing several assay systems to prove through with experiments that they have these kind of properties, whether anti-inflammatory or whether there are immuno-boosting or antivirals, etc., etc. After having done to do a preclinical toxicology to show that it is safe. Safety is one of the important things. After safety is proved, you do a human kind of safety by doing a phase 1 trial. This is called the first phase of looking whether it is safe for the human beings. And then we go to the second phase kind of a clinical trial, which is also a small restricted efficacy study. And then phase 3 is a major trial where large number of clinical cases will be involved. Invariably, it will be a multi-centric kind of a trial that will be done, and afterwards only the phase 4 clinical trial will take place. So there are several drugs that have come out. As you would have seen, there are some drugs that have come in also. Regarding the vaccines, there are 120 vaccines are now being attempted world over, out of which 41 have already passed the early development stage, and they are in different kind of platforms. Some of them are DNA vaccines, some of them are inactivated vaccines, live attenuated viral vaccines, non-replicating another virus being used like adenovirus and so on, and the protein subunit vaccine, etc. So you do have different models through which virus vaccines are coming up. And in our own country, institutions like Bharat Biotech, Serum Institute of India, Zydus Cadila, all of them have come up with different formats of vaccine which are now in the clinical trial stages. Very shortly, maybe in a few months' time, we will be having a kind of vaccines, at least minimum 2 of the vaccines from India, which would have passed through the phase 3 trial. And India being a massive manufacturers and scale-up kind of a systems are available in India, we may be able to supply vaccine to the entire world. We will wait for that day to come. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. Rajgopal, sir, another dimension of health crisis due to this pandemic is the toll on our mental health. From March 25th, 12 a.m., we stepped into the world of lockdowns and everything suddenly came to a halt. healthcare workers, students, parents, everyone is undergoing stress physically and mentally. So how should one be prepared to handle this mentally?
Yeah, I'm obviously not the very correct person to be handling issues related to mental health. I am completely in the wrong end of the spectrum as far as the management of these issues are concerned. But the way I would look at it is like this. I don't think these lockdowns are going to go on endlessly at the level of intensity that it is currently being enforced at. So if the government is going to go through a process of easing this lockdown, the most important thing that all of us should recognize is just because they ease the lockdown, it doesn't mean that the risk has been eliminated completely. And we should continue to preserve our responsibility, basically, to try and keep the social distancing, masking, and other important aspects that we can control through this entire period. So while the government can play its role in terms of de-intensifying the levels of the lockdown, and there are certain models. Actually, there are current model of lockdown is basically looking at where the maximum number of cases are, and then effectively tightening controls over those areas. There are other models that can base it on the density of the population, the number of elders that are in a given population, to make a more granular kind of an approach to the lockdown that can ease a lot of these problems to a great extent. And if that becomes popular, we should probably recognize very clearly that the only way in which we can continue, and it's going to take a long time. Vaccines are not ready already. And if the predicted models from the Tamil Nadu government says that you're going to have your peak sometime in October, you're going to expect that we have to keep this kind of restricted activity. Until that point in time, our responsibility is going to be purely from the fact that we need to prevent the spread of infection through simple hygiene measures, which have been recommended over this period of time. I can't think of anything else. The other ways in which you can improve your own mental health obviously will depend on your own background and your own values. Somebody with a strong spiritual kind of basis can definitely fall on that. And I keep emphasizing, because recently I have become a very strong convert towards physical activity. And that is something that I find very refreshing. Every morning I either run or walk or cycle, individually and independently, wearing a mask on myself, and it does preserve my equanimity for the rest of the day. And these are the kinds of things that we need to do. Please remember that one thing that we cannot do is have social get-togethers. And obviously, the internet is providing us with the options of having these get-togethers without being physically present in the same room. But again, I think we need to understand that we need to adapt it by identifying what is important for us and trying to see if we can do it in a safe kind of environment. So that is the way I would feel about this situation.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. One final question to Sudha Seshan, ma'am. Ma'am, the first case of COVID-19 in India was reported on 30th Jan 2020, and the focus of this webinar is actually the COVID and the way forward. So, ma'am, what is the way forward actually? And with the spread of infection, what special steps need to be taken to bring this under control, ma'am?
See, before I answer this question, I would like to kind of answer another question which I normally face. Many people keep asking, when so many other countries have started the downslope, why is it that we are still having increase in the number of cases? We would have to understand that ours is a very largely populous country. In any epidemic, the general peaking occurs only when about 50 to 60% of the population has been exposed to the infection. That is when the upslope stops and then the downslope commences. When generally the peaking has occurred, after the peaking, it is either a downslope or a continuous plateau. As now it appears, India will go for a downslope and not a continuous plateau. But then we have not had our peaking until now because we are very largely populous. We cannot compare ourselves to Germany or Italy or Sweden or any other country like that, wherein the population is just about the population of one of our states. So this is a very important factor that we need to remember. It is that our population is still getting exposed, and maybe some more will get exposed. So what can we do under these circumstances to prevent major damages? Now, the thing is, when people are exposed, people are getting infected. Most of you will know, as per the current trend, it is about 80% and over 80% who remain asymptomatic. I say more than 80% is that, as we have calculated, the ICMR has released the statistics. People, if they are infected and show symptoms, it will be about 2.7% will require an ICU treatment. Another 2.7% will require high flow oxygen. About 0.3 to 0.5% will require ventilator. Now, if you total all this, it is just about 6 to 7%. And 6 to 7% will require intense treatment, even if you allow margination, which we normally do in any epidemiological analysis. 30% of people who get infected may require hospital treatment, which may be mild kind of treatment requirement, or it can be something like a ventilator. Or 70% of us will remain asymptomatic. Now, that is a good thing about COVID-19. If you compare COVID-19 to SARS or MERS, there the killing power of the virus was very high. If the killing power of the virus is high, the transmission is low, because it infects someone, that someone develops disease and gets killed, the virus chain is cut off. But then if the killing power of the virus is, someone gets infected, transmits the infection to someone else, and ultimately the chain keeps going around, so you have more people getting infected. Now, killing power of SARS-CoV-2 is low. That is the reason 70 to 80% can remain asymptomatic. That is a good thing. But then what do? We will have to anticipate that the virus will remain with us for some more months to come. It will not bid farewell today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and run away. As Professor SPT said, herd immunity, the best scientific way of herd immunity is to have a vaccine. Now, there was a question related to smallpox. Please remember, smallpox made its appearance on Earth, affecting human beings 12,000 years ago, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, 12,000 years ago. Smallpox came similar to this from a rodent virus. It became a human virus. So to develop herd immunity, we require a vaccine. That is the most scientific way. But then, until we get a vaccine or until we get a cure, what can we do? What is the way forward? As Professor Ram Rajgopal said, we probably will have to practice, get trained to all the hygiene measures. I would classify them into three: the personal hygiene measures, distancing hygiene, environmental hygiene. Personal hygiene, your mask, wearing the mask, hand hygiene, cough etiquette, trying to keep yourself away if you have even the smallest of the small symptoms, things like that. Distancing hygiene, yes, there is a necessity for us to practice physical distancing, be it your office, your institution, your academy, or anywhere, even at home, preferably. And environmental hygiene, keep surfaces clean, keep your environment clean, and most important, I think, as Dr. Ram said, physical activity, normal physical efficient activity to keep yourself generally healthy, keep your food healthy, and probably have all the positive measures. That should be the way forward to combat COVID, to live with COVID. And I say learn to live with COVID. It does not mean that we'll have to accept the damages of COVID, but we should also know to combat COVID by adapting ourselves to prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Learn to live with COVID. And Professor Tyagarajan sir and Dr. Rajgopal sir, if you could please give your way forward and closing comments, please.
Yeah, I will make it, I think, through an acronym. Let us really communicate. We are communicating through SMS very frequently. We give SMS every day, hundreds of them. Let us keep this SMS as a pivotal message that we can pass it on. The first S is use soap and water wash, and M, use mask, and S, social distancing. If you can wash your hands frequently, keep your personal hygiene, and if you wear mask properly, not wearing mask alone is not sufficient. It has to be worn properly. Many times what happens is people wear mask, but when they are speaking, they lower down the mask, which again does not serve the purpose at all. And lastly, social distancing or physical distancing is also very, very important. So all of us have to jointly promote this campaign across the strata of people. Those who are really at the lower socio-economic status and not very much educated and so on, we have to communicate this message, and that is where spiritual organizations like Chinmaya and others can play a major role in communicating these preventive measures by which we can control this fastly spreading pandemic, and we hope that we will achieve this target. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Dr. Rajgopalan, sir.
As much as I would also like to emphasize the same issues as Professor Tyagarajan said. I'm going to steal his SMS idea very happily. I think it is a very valid kind of a point. Very clearly that these three aspects of preventive hygiene is going to be extremely important through the entire process. But for me, there has been another very interesting lesson. As depressing as this disease has been, as difficult as it has been in terms of its treatment, it has also promoted a level of international cooperation and a rapidity of scientific advance that we have never seen before. We are sitting here lamenting the absence of a vaccine, but as you probably know, the New England Journal reported the first initial phase 3 vaccine of an RNA vaccine that has been published already. And when you look at the time span that they're talking about, this RNA vaccine came into existence roughly within 6 months after the onset of all this research activity, which is extremely fast. Most other vaccines, this stage is usually reached somewhere roughly between 6 and 9 years. We have achieved in what was normally achieved in 6 to 9 years within a span of 6 months. And if we continue to do this kind of activity, and obviously the technology, the interdependence of varying international groups has really made a dramatic improvement in the way in which we are developing treatments. And to me, that is a positive kind of message that I would like to take. But still more important from our own perspective, as we always say, please remember Professor Tyagarajan's SMS. If you forget it, especially in the circumstance where they are trying to reduce the levels of lockdown, if we start rejoicing this by not wearing our masks or throwing our masks in the air, I think we will hurt ourselves much more than any other process. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity for being on this panel.